His dog stood frozen in the dark hallway of a house that hadn't known a living soul in years. Koda's nose pointed straight at the stone fireplace, trembling not with fear, but with something older, something deeper. It was the same urgency the dog showed every time Garrett was about to fall apart, every time the nightmares dragged him back to the sand, every time his hands started shaking and the world shrank to the size of a coffin. Something was hidden behind that wall, something buried so deep it had waited 34 years for someone broken enough to listen. And standing behind his dog in the dust and the silence, Garrett Hollis had no idea that what Koda found would cost $260 million, and that it would save his life in ways money never could. Tell us where you are watching from today. Drop your state or your country in the comments. Like and subscribe, because this story is going to stay with you long after it ends. The wind had been building since before dawn, scratching at the thin walls of the cabin like something trying to get inside. By afternoon, the whole ridge above Thunder Creek seemed to vibrate with it. The pines bent and groaned. The windows rattled in their frames. And Garrett Hollis sat at his kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. He was 52 years old. His hair had turned the color of iron filings sometime after his third deployment and never went back. His shoulders still carried the square set of a man trained to stand at attention, but they curved forward, now pulled down by a weight no one else could see. His right knee had been rebuilt twice, once in a field hospital outside Fallujah, and once at the VA in Billings, and it ached in the cold, the way a memory aches when you try not to think about it. He walked with a slight hitch. He sat down carefully. He stood up even more carefully, always gripping something, the edge of a table, the back of a chair, the frame of a door, as if the world might tilt without warning and throw him to the ground. The cabin was small, 2 rooms and a bathroom that barely fit a man his size. He had chosen it for the quiet. Less noise, fewer triggers, fewer people asking questions he could not answer. But the silence had its own way of filling up a room. It pressed in from the walls. It pooled in the corners. And on days like this, when the wind screamed through the pines and the sky turned the color of old metal, the silence inside his own head became the loudest thing of all. Koda lay at his feet, chin resting on the toe of Garrett's boot ears, twitching with every gust that slammed the cabin. A German shepherd 7 years old, built like a soldier and scarred like one too. They had served together. They had bled together. They had been discharged together after an IED turned a routine patrol into something Garrett still could not talk about without his hands going numb. The wind shrieked. The cabin shook. And inside Garrett's head something shifted. The sound changed first. The pine trees became sand. The rattling windows became the rattle of a .50 caliber mounted on a Humvee. His breath caught in his throat, and his fingers tightened around the mug until the knuckles turned white, and his vision tunneled down to a single bright point surrounded by darkness. He was not in Montana anymore. He was in a street with no name in a city made of dust, and someone was screaming. Koda moved before Garrett knew he needed him. The dog did not bark. He never barked during these moments. Instead, Koda pressed his full weight against Garrett's leg, 85 pounds of warm, solid breathing presence pushing into the muscle of his calf. Then, Koda lifted his head and placed it on Garrett's thigh, directly over the femoral artery where the pulse hammered fastest. And Koda breathed. Slow, deep, steady. The way he had been trained to breathe when his handler's world was falling apart. Garrett's free hand found the dog's fur. He gripped it. He held on like a man gripping the edge of a cliff. His mouth moved, forming words that came from somewhere underneath the panic. "I'm here, I'm here, I'm here." The sand faded. The screaming stopped. The cabin walls came back thin and creaking but real. The coffee mug was still in his other hand, unbroken. The wind still howled, but it was only wind again. Only Montana. Only the ridge above Thunder Creek, where nobody came and nobody called and nobody expected anything from a man who had already given everything he had. Koda licked his wrist once, twice, then settled back down at his feet, pressing his shoulder against Garrett's ankle as if nothing had happened, as if pulling a man out of hell was just another part of the day. "Good boy," Garrett whispered. His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "Good boy." He sat there for a long time, feeling his heartbeat slow, listening to the wind. The light outside shifted from gray to something darker, and the shadows inside the cabin grew thicker. He should eat. He should check the generator. He should do any of the small things that kept a man alive from one day to the next. But instead, he sat and he listened to his dog breathe. And he tried not to think about the fact that Koda was the only living thing on Earth that still needed him. A hard thud against the porch broke the stillness. Koda's head snapped up. One sharp bark, short and controlled. A warning, not an alarm. Garrett was on his feet before he finished thinking, hand reaching for the drawer where he kept his old service flashlight. Not a weapon. Just something familiar. Something from a life that used to make sense. The wind had knocked something against the door. He could hear it fluttering, catching on the latch. Koda paced toward the entrance, nose low, tail stiff, reading the air the way a soldier reads a map. Garrett opened the door, and the cold hit him like a wall. The pines were bending almost to the ground. Snow from the morning's flurries lifted off the earth in white spirals and danced across the clearing. There on the porch sat an envelope weighed down by a smooth river stone. No return address, just his full name printed in bold black letters. Garrett Hollis. He stared at it. Letters did not come up here, not unless something was wrong. He crouched slowly, favoring his bad knee, and picked it up. The paper felt heavier than it should. Koda sniffed it once, nose-twitching tail straight with uncertainty. "Easy, boy," Garrett muttered, though he felt the same tight pull behind his own ribs. Inside, under the dim yellow light of the cabin's single lamp, the letterhead almost glowed. Mathers and Callaway Legal Services, Helena, Montana. Lawyers did not write to men living alone in rotting cabins on mountain ridges unless something had gone very wrong. He unfolded the paper with hands that were not entirely steady. "We regret to inform you of the passing of Captain Warren Selby, United States Air Force, retired." He stopped. The name stirred something distant. A memory thin as smoke. An old man on a bench outside the VA hospital in Billings. It had been winter 8 months ago, and the man was slumped sideways in the cold, coatless shaking. Garrett had been leaving after a rough appointment, head-pounding, nerves shot, wanting nothing but to get back to his truck and drive until the world stopped pressing in on him. But he had seen the old man, and he had stopped. He remembered kneeling beside him, draping his own jacket over the stranger's shoulders, calling for the nurse, staying until they wheeled him inside. The old man had gripped his hand with surprising strength and looked at him with eyes that carried the kind of weight Garrett recognized, the weight of a man who had seen too much and held it for too long. "You're a good man," the old man had whispered. "The kind who doesn't walk away." Garrett had not thought about that night again. Not once. Until now. Captain Selby designated you as his sole heir to his property located at Thunder Creek Ridge, including the residence commonly known as the Selby Estate. You are instructed to take possession within 30 days. Garrett read it twice, then a third time. The words stayed the same. Clear. Impossible. A mansion on Thunder Creek Ridge from a man he had met for 20 minutes in a snowstorm. The letter fell softly onto the table. Koda nudged his hand, whining. The cabin suddenly felt smaller than it ever had, as if the walls were leaning inward, listening. It doesn't make sense, Garrett whispered. But even as he said it, something cold and quiet climbed his spine. Not fear, exactly. Something underneath the fear, older and heavier. The sense that this was not random, that Captain Warren Selby had not chosen him by accident. The old man had been sharp, even in pain. Even collapsing in the cold, his eyes had carried the focus of someone who measured everything, who calculated the weight of a man's character in the space of a handshake. Every word Selby had spoken that night came back to Garrett now in pieces, rising out of the dark, the way debris rises after an explosion, slowly turning, catching the light. You're a good man. The kind who doesn't walk away. Garrett stared at the letter. The kind who doesn't walk away. But walking away was all Garrett had done for the past 4 years. He had walked away from the army, walked away from the city, walked away from his apartment. His therapist, the last friend who still returned his calls. He had walked all the way to the top of a mountain in Montana and built a life out of not being seen. And now, a dead man was asking him to turn around. Koda stiffened, suddenly staring out the window toward the ridge where the Selby estate stood somewhere beyond the tree line. His body went rigid, every muscle locked, nose pointed into the distance. No bark, no growl. Just absolute stillness, the kind that meant Koda had detected something his human could not yet understand. The dog held the position for a long 10 seconds, then slowly relaxed and turned back to Garrett, pressing his nose against the palm of Garrett's hand, as if to say, "Whatever is out there, we will deal with it together." Garrett rested his hand on the dog's back. "Yeah," he murmured. "I got a bad feeling, too." He did not sleep that night. He sat in the chair by the window with Koda at his feet, and the letter on the table, and the wind outside dying slowly to a whisper. He thought about Warren Selby dying alone in a hospital room. He thought about a man who spent 34 years carrying a secret because he believed that no one decent would ever come looking. He thought about what it meant that Selby had been right about that no one had come until a stranger knelt beside him in the snow for no reason other than it was the right thing to do. By the time the first gray light crept through the pines, Garrett had made no decision. But he was dressed, and his bag was packed. And Koda was already waiting at the truck door, tail low, ears high, sensing that today was not like any other day they had shared. By morning the storm had broken. The forest stood soaked and glistening in pale light, as if Thunder Creek had taken one long breath and let it out slowly. Garrett loaded his truck with the few things he owned that mattered: a flashlight, a thermos of coffee, the letter, and Koda. The dog sat in the passenger seat with his front paws on the dashboard, scanning the road ahead with the focused attention of a soldier on point. The road up to Thunder Creek Ridge was cracked and narrow, winding between steep drops and walls of dark evergreen that leaned inward like they were trying to listen to whoever passed. Fog clung to the ground in long white ribbons, swirling under the tires as the truck climbed higher. At one point, the trees thinned, and Garrett caught his first glimpse of the ridge above. And there, perched on the highest point, like a dark crown, sat the outline of a house. Large, weathered, watching him approach. The driveway appeared around a final curve. Two massive stone pillars framed a rusted iron gate hanging crooked on its hinges. The sign overhead read, "Selby Estate barely visible under decades of moss and neglect." Ivy had climbed the pillars so thickly that the stone beneath had disappeared entirely, consumed by green, as if the forest was slowly pulling the entrance back into itself. One of the pillars had a crack running from top to bottom wide enough to fit a hand inside, and from the crack grew a single wild rose bush blooming white despite the cold, as if something in this place refused to stop being alive. Garrett parked and stepped out. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 3 steps. The air here was different from the air at his cabin, thinner, older. It tasted of wet stone and pine needles and something faintly chemical like rust or old iron. Koda jumped down beside him, nose already working the air in rapid bursts, cataloging every scent the forest offered, sorting threat from curiosity with the precision of a machine built for exactly this purpose. The gate groaned when Garrett pushed it open, metal scraping stone like fingernails across concrete. Beyond it, a path wound uphill through towering pines, their branches heavy with morning dew. The ground was soft with fallen needles and old leaves. Each step felt like walking deeper into something forgotten. Then the mansion revealed itself. It rose out of the mist with a weight that made Garrett stop mid-stride. 3 stories of dark timber and aging stone windows clouded with years of dust roof sagging in the middle like a spine that had carried too much for too long. The porch wrapped around the front wide and long, but half the boards had warped and darkened with rain and rot. A single rocking chair sat near the door, swaying gently in air that was perfectly still. Koda let out a low whine. Not fear. Caution, just a house, Garrett murmured, though the knot in his stomach said otherwise. He tested each porch board before trusting it with his weight. The front door was massive, carved with old military emblems, a pair of wings, a star, the faint outline of an aircraft. The brass handle was ice cold. The moment he pushed the door open, air thick with dust and something older poured out, like a breath held for decades. Mold, pine resin, loneliness. The smell of a place that had been waiting. Koda pressed forward cautiously, nose to the floor, reading the house the way he once read dirt roads in Iraq, looking for what was hidden, what was wrong, what did not belong. The foyer stretched wide. A staircase spiraled upward into shadows. A chandelier hung at a crooked angle, its crystals coated in grime. Every surface carried dust thick enough to write on. The wallpaper peeled. The hardwood buckled in places. But underneath all of it, Garrett felt something he could not name. The silence was not empty. It was full, heavy, as if the house itself was aware that someone had finally come. They moved through the rooms slowly. Each one felt like turning a page in a book that had been closed for decades. An old parlor with furniture draped in white sheets like sleeping ghosts, the fabric yellowed at the edges, holding the shape of chairs and tables beneath them, as if the furniture was simply waiting for someone to pull the covers off and sit down. The air tasted of pine resin and old wool, and the faintest trace of tobacco smoke, so old it had become part of the walls themselves. A dining room with a table long enough to seat 20, its surface scarred with rings from coffee cups and water glasses, each mark a small record of a meal, eaten, a conversation held, a life lived in this house, before silence swallowed it whole. Garrett ran his finger along one of the rings. The wood was smooth beneath the dust. Someone had polished this table, many times. Someone had cared about it. Koda moved ahead of him, methodical, thorough checking corners and sniffing beneath furniture the way he used to clear rooms in Fallujah. But this was different. There was no tension in the dog's body, no coiled readiness for violence. Instead, Koda moved with something closer to curiosity, as if the house was telling him a story through its smells, and he was trying to follow it to the end. The study stopped Garrett in his tracks. Bookshelves climbed floor to ceiling, packed with leather-bound volumes and aviation manuals and stacks of National Geographic magazines from the 1980s. Maps hung crooked on the walls, some of Montana, some of places Garrett recognized from briefings he wished he could forget. And draped over the back of a leather chair that still held the impression of the man who had last sat in it, an old flight jacket with Captain Selby's name stitched above the breast pocket in gold thread that had faded to the color of straw. Garrett touched the jacket. The leather was cracked and soft, worn thin at the elbows and the collar where a man's neck would rest against it during long flights. It smelled of altitude and engine oil and something private, the scent of a man's fear and courage mixed together over years until they became the same thing. Garrett held it for a moment longer than he meant to, then set it back down carefully, as if it might break. On the desk beneath the jacket, journals lay stacked in neat rows. Garrett opened the nearest one. The handwriting was small and precise, the writing of a man who measured every word the way a pilot measures fuel, knowing that waste could be fatal. The early entries were routine: flight logs, weather notes, maintenance records. But as the pages turned, the tone darkened. Names were redacted, coordinates circled, phrases underlined with such force the pen had nearly torn through the paper. Koda kept returning to one direction. Every few rooms he would pause, turn his head toward the back of the house, and sniff with a slow, deliberate pull of air through his nostrils. Then he would continue, but always with one ear turned that way, always tracking something beneath the surface of the house, following a trail that ran deeper than floorboards and plaster. Garrett was about to call him back when he heard something from outside. Footsteps, light, careful, coming up the porch. He moved to the window. Through the grime on the glass, he saw a woman standing at the bottom of the porch steps. She was in her late 60s, maybe 67, with silver hair pulled back in a loose knot. She wore a gray wool coat that had seen many winters, and she stood very still, looking up at the house the way a person looks at a grave they have been avoiding for a long time. In her hands, she held something small, a piece of knitting, blue yarn the color of a winter sky wrapped around 2 needles with a few inches of fabric hanging beneath them, unfinished, abandoned mid-stitch. Garrett opened the door. The woman did not startle. She looked at him as if she had been expecting someone, though not him specifically. Her eyes were clear and dry, but the skin around them carried the marks of a grief so long and so deep it had become part of her face. Before Garrett could speak, Koda moved past him. The dog walked down the porch steps slowly, head low, tail soft, and stopped directly in front of the woman. Then Koda sat. He lowered his head and leaned his shoulder gently against her knee, the way he did when he sensed someone carrying a pain too heavy for words. The woman looked down at the dog. Her lips parted slightly. Her hand, the one not holding the knitting, reached out and touched the top of Koda's head. Her fingers trembled. "I haven't touched a dog in a very long time," she said quietly. "Warren had one. A shepherd like yours. She waited for him by the door every evening for 3 years after he stopped coming home. She waited until the day she died." Garrett stood in the doorway, unsure of what to say. He did not need to say anything. Koda was doing what Koda always did, finding the wound before anyone pointed to it. "I'm Dorothea Selby," the woman said. "Most people call me Dottie. Warren was my husband." The word husband came out carefully, the way a person handles something that still cuts. "We separated in 2003, 20 years ago. He kept his secrets, and I kept my distance, and we both told ourselves it was the right thing." She looked up at the house again. "I haven't walked through that door since the day I left." Garrett stepped aside. "Would you like to come in?" Dottie did not answer right away. She looked down at the knitting in her hands, running her thumb across the blue yarn. "He started this for me. A scarf. The winter before I left. He never finished it. I found it in a box he sent to my sister's house after I moved out. I've carried it with me ever since." She held it up slightly, and Garrett could see the last stitch still hanging loose on the needle, the yarn trailing off into nothing. A sentence stopped in the middle of a word. "I came today because I heard someone inherited the house," Dottie said. "I was afraid. Afraid they would tear it down. Afraid they would find what Warren hid and not understand it. Afraid they would destroy the last piece of him that still existed in this world." Koda pressed closer against her leg. Dottie placed her hand fully on his head and held it there. "Come in," Garrett said again, softer this time. "I think there are things in here that belong to you." They walked through the house together, Dottie and Garrett and Koda between them. Dottie moved slowly, touching walls, pausing at doorways, breathing in rooms she had not entered in 2 decades. When they reached the study, she stopped. Her eyes found the flight jacket on the chair. Her hand went to her mouth. But Koda was not interested in the study. He had already moved past them into the hallway toward the kitchen at the back of the house. His nails clicked faster now. His body lowered. He was tracking something. Garrett followed. Koda stood in the old kitchen, a room frozen in time with cracked white tile and dead appliances from another decade. The dog paced in a tight circle near a large wooden cabinet bolted to the wall, then began scratching at its base with the controlled urgency of a K9 who had found something real. "What is it, boy?" Garrett crouched and ran his fingers along the seam where cabinet met wall. Cold air leaked through. A draft where there should be no draft. He braced his shoulder and pushed. The cabinet groaned, nails snapping from old wood and tilted forward. Garrett caught it and lowered it to the floor. Behind it was a door, small, barely 4 feet high, set into the wall like an afterthought. No handle, just a metal latch and a keypad so old it looked like it belonged in a Cold War bunker. A single red light blinked slowly, faintly still alive after all these years. Garrett turned to Dottie, who had followed them into the kitchen. "Did you know about this?" Dottie stared at the door. "I knew he was hiding something. I never knew where." Garrett turned back to the keypad. He tried obvious numbers. Selby's birth year, his service number. Each time the red light pulsed a flat denial. Koda sat beside him, patient watching. Then the dog lifted his paw and pressed it against the keypad. His nail hit a small function key offset from the number grid, a key Garrett had not noticed. "Buddy," Garrett whispered, "you're something else." He entered the number from Selby's military dog tag, the one stamped inside the flight jacket pocket, and finished by pressing the key Koda had found. The red light held for 1 long second. Then it turned green. A heavy mechanical click echoed behind the wall. The door swung inward with a hiss of pressurized air, releasing a breath that smelled of metal dust and decades of sealed darkness. A narrow concrete staircase descended into nothing. Koda went first. He always went first. That was the arrangement they had carried from Iraq to Montana without ever discussing it. The dog leads. The man follows. Trust is not a word between them. It is a direction. Garrett followed flashlight, cutting through the black, each step taking him deeper beneath the house. The walls changed from wood to concrete, then from concrete to reinforced steel. Pipes lined the ceiling in neat rows. The air grew colder with each step, 10 degrees 15, until his breath came out in thin white clouds that the flashlight turned into small ghosts. It felt as though the earth itself had been holding its breath for 34 years and was only now beginning to exhale. At the bottom, another door, full-sized, military-grade steel, the kind Garrett recognized from forward operating bases. The kind designed to keep things in as much as to keep things out. He entered the same code. Green light. Bolts unlocked one by one, each one a deep mechanical thud that echoed through the stairwell like a heartbeat restarting. The vault opened. The first thing he noticed was not the size of the room. It was the cold. Not basement cold. The kind of biting bone-deep chill that clung to metal and whispered of things kept too long in the dark. The concrete floor carried that cold straight through the soles of his boots and into the aching joint of his rebuilt knee. Rows of steel shelving stretched the length of the room, each stacked with uniform bundles of cash wrapped in paper bands stamped with numbers that made Garrett's stomach tighten. The air smelled of ink and old paper and something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. The smell of money stored so long, it had begun to take on the character of the room itself, cold and patient and waiting. Garrett's flashlight swept across shelf after shelf. His hand trembled. Not from the cold. Millions. Dozens of stacks per shelf. Rows going deep into shadow. More money than he had ever imagined existing in one place. More money than he had earned in his entire life, multiplied by 100. More money than seemed possible in a room beneath an old man's house in the mountains of Montana. Koda growled softly, pressing against Garrett's leg. Not alarm. Unease. The dog could feel it too. The weight of what this room contained, the gravity of it pulling at them both. Yeah, boy, Garrett whispered. I feel it too. On a metal table at the center of the vault sat a single leather case, old and worn, the name Selby carved into the surface. Garrett opened it. Inside lay a USB drive labeled Truth and a handwritten letter. The letter began in Selby's sharp, slanted handwriting. Garrett, if you are reading this, it means I did not live long enough to do what I should have done decades ago. Selby wrote of 1989. A mission in Panama. 4 pilots ordered to pick up metal cases from a jungle airstrip. The cases were supposed to contain intelligence materials. Instead, they held cash. Millions in bribe money connected to an unauthorized operation buried so deep that the men who ran it believed it would never surface. Selby tried to report it. He was silenced. The other pilots either turned, disappeared, or drank themselves into graves. Selby spent 34 years hiding the money so it would not fall back into the hands of the men who created it. But the last page of the letter was different. The handwriting changed, became shakier, written by a hand running out of time. I did not keep this money for myself. I kept it because I had a dream I was too afraid to build while they were still watching. A place where soldiers like you and me could come when the war followed them home. A place with open doors and quiet rooms and dogs who know how to sit with a man while he remembers how to breathe. I could not build it, but you can. If you found this, do not let it die here. Use it. Every dollar. Build what I could not. And forgive me for asking so much of a man I only met once in the snow. A metal clipboard hung on the far wall. Total inventory as of final count January 2024. $260,400,000. Garrett let the clipboard fall to his side. His breath was shallow. The room felt like it was spinning slowly, the weight of that number pressing down on him, like the sky pressing down on a mountain. Koda nudged his hand, anchoring him. "I know, buddy," Garrett whispered. "This isn't just money. This is everything." He carried the letter upstairs. Dottie was standing in the study, holding the flight jacket against her chest, eyes closed. When she opened them and saw Garrett's face, she knew. She knew something had been found. Something Warren had buried beneath their life together. Garrett handed her the letter. There was a section at the end separate, written in different ink, addressed to her. Dottie. Every night I did not sleep beside you was a night I kept you safe. They were watching. They would have come for you if they knew what I had. I chose silence to protect you, not because I stopped loving you. I never stopped. Not for one day in 20 years. Forgive me. The scarf was supposed to be finished by Christmas. I am sorry I ran out of time for that too. Dottie read it standing up. Her lips moved with the words, but no sound came out. When she reached the part about the scarf, about Christmas, about running out of time, her knees softened and she sat down slowly in Warren's leather chair. The chair that still held the shape of him. The chair that smelled of his aftershave and his flight jacket and the quiet desperation of a man who spent 34 years carrying a burden he believed would kill anyone he shared it with. She pressed the letter against her chest with both hands, the way you hold something that is both precious and unbearable at the same time. And she cried without making a sound. Her shoulders shook. Her eyes squeezed shut. The blue knitting slipped from her lap to the floor, the unfinished scarf landing softly on the dusty boards, the last stitch still hanging from the needle, like a question that would never be answered. 20 years of distance, 20 years of silence between two people who had loved each other. And all of it because one man believed that the only way to protect the woman he loved was to let her believe he had stopped loving her. Koda walked to her. He did not rush. He moved with the gentle deliberation of a creature who understood that grief has its own timing and cannot be hurried. He lay down at her feet and rested his chin on her shoe, exactly as he did with Garrett, exactly as he always did with the ones who were hurting most. His eyes stayed open, watching her steady and soft. Dottie's hand found the top of his head. She held it there. Her crying slowed. Her breathing deepened. And for a moment in that dusty study, filled with a dead man's books and maps and dreams, the only sound was a woman breathing and a dog breathing with her. Garrett stood in the doorway and watched. His throat was tight. His eyes burned. He understood now. This was not just an inheritance. It was not just a secret. It was not even just money. It was an unfinished life handed to a stranger with the hope that the stranger might be brave enough to complete it. A dream written in a dying man's handwriting. A love letter that arrived 20 years too late. And a dog who somehow knew exactly where to be. He looked at the journals stacked on the desk. He looked at the flight jacket on the chair. He looked at Dottie, silver-haired and shaking, holding a letter from a man she would never see again. And he felt something move inside him that had been still for a very long time. Not courage, not certainty. Something quieter than that. The first faint stirring of purpose in a man who had forgotten what the word meant. Dottie opened her eyes. She looked at Garrett through tears, and said something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. If you do this, you will not just pull this house out of the dark. You will pull this whole town out of a sleep that has lasted 34 years. Garrett did not answer right away. He was not a man who made promises easily. He had made promises before in the desert to men who did not come home, and those broken promises still sat in his chest like stones he could not swallow and could not spit out. But Dottie was not asking for a promise. She was asking for something harder. She was asking him to try. He looked at Koda. Koda looked back at him with those steady brown eyes that had seen everything Garrett had seen, every explosion, every scream, every night spent shaking on a cold floor, and still believed in him, still chose him, every single day. Then Koda's head snapped toward the window. His ears went straight up. His body locked rigid. Through the grime on the glass, barely visible through the afternoon fog rolling over Thunder Creek, a black SUV sat at the end of the long driveway. Engine off, lights off, just sitting there, watching. Someone already knew Garrett was here, and they had been waiting. The black SUV did not move. It sat at the end of the driveway like a held breath engine off windows tinted so dark that whoever was inside existed only as a possibility. Garrett stood at the window of the study for a long time, watching it through the grime on the glass. Koda stood beside him, rigid ears locked forward, every muscle taut beneath his fur. The dog did not bark. He did not growl. He simply watched with the focused stillness of an animal who has learned the difference between noise and danger. Dottie had gone home before the SUV appeared. She had left the same way she came, quietly clutching the unfinished scarf and the letter from Warren against her chest, walking down the porch steps without looking back, as if looking back might undo whatever small piece of courage she had gathered to come in the first place. Garrett had watched her go. He had wanted to say something, but could not find the words. The weight of what they had found in the vault sat between them like a third person in the room too large to speak around. Now it was just Garrett and Koda and the house and the black SUV at the end of the drive. It stayed for 40 minutes. Then as the fog thickened and the last light drained out of the sky, it pulled away slowly, its taillights disappearing into the pines like two red eyes closing. Garrett did not sleep that night. He sat in the leather chair in the study with Koda at his feet and Selby's journals spread across the desk. He read by flashlight because the mansion's electricity had been dead for years. The words in those journals carried the weight of a man drowning slowly in a secret too large to share and too dangerous to release. Selby had written about the other pilots, 4 of them in total. 1 drank himself to death within 5 years of the mission. Another vanished without a trace somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. A third had joined the men who wanted the money buried, forever had traded his silence for safety, and spent the next 3 decades pretending the whole thing never happened. That third pilot had a name. Selby mentioned it only once, buried in an entry from 1996, written in handwriting so tight it looked like the words were trying to hide themselves on the page. Malcolm Greer, now with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. The man who sold us all. Garrett closed the journal. The name sat in his chest like a splinter. The SUV returned the next morning. This time it did not park at the end of the drive. It came all the way up to the porch gravel, popping under its tires with a sound like small bones breaking. Koda was on his feet before the engine cut. 1 bark, short, controlled. A notification, not a warning. The man who stepped out was in his middle 50s. Gray hair cut close, dark suit that fit like it had been measured twice. He moved the way men move when they have worn a uniform for so long that the uniform has become their skeleton. Straight spine, level shoulders, eyes that scan the tree line before they scan the porch. Military posture, living inside a civilian body. He walked toward the front door with his hands visible and his pace unhurried. 3 firm knocks. The sound echoed through the empty foyer like stones dropped into a well. Garrett opened the door just enough to see through. Koda positioned himself in the gap shoulder, pressing against Garrett's leg eyes locked on the visitor. Mr. Hollis. The man offered a polite nod, though his eyes remained sharp, measuring. I'm Agent Malcolm Greer, Defense Criminal Investigative Service. The name landed like a cold nail driven into wood. Garrett felt it in his spine. Koda felt the spike of tension and pressed closer, reading his handler's body, the way a seismograph reads the earth. May I come in? No. Greer's jaw tightened by a fraction. Not enough to be threatening. Just enough to show he was not accustomed to hearing that word. He recovered smoothly, folding his hands behind his back in a gesture that was meant to appear relaxed, but carried the precision of a man who controls every movement he makes. Mr. Hollis, I'm here because we have reason to believe this property contains materials related to a classified operation from 1989. Sensitive government assets that Captain Selby may have retained without authorization before his passing. Garrett kept his face still. The year. The same year in the journals. The same year everything went sideways in a jungle airstrip in Panama. We would like permission to conduct a review of the premises. Nothing invasive, simply confirming that federal property is secure. The subtext was as clear as if Greer had spoken it aloud. We know you found something. We know you opened the vault. And we are not leaving without it. You have a warrant. No, Greer admitted, but obtaining one would not be difficult. Then go get one. Greer held Garrett's eyes for a long moment. The air between them tightened. Koda stepped forward, placing himself fully in the doorway. Teeth slightly visible, not baring them, but letting them be seen. Reading the man's posture the way a soldier reads a map of hostile territory. Greer looked down at the dog, then back at Garrett. Mr. Hollis, he said quietly, I would prefer this to remain civil. So would I. Another pause. Greer straightened his suit jacket, a small, unnecessary adjustment that men make when they are deciding whether to push harder or pull back. Before I go, Greer said, and his voice shifted, dropping half a register, becoming something more personal, more aimed. I want you to understand something. Selby did not choose you because you are special. He chose you because you are alone. Because a man with no one left to lose will do anything for a reason to wake up in the morning. He used your loneliness, Mr. Hollis. He saw a broken man, and he handed him a purpose, like a leash. The words hit Garrett in a place he had no armor for. He felt them land in his stomach, in the hollow space behind his ribs, where the things he could not say to his therapist lived. His jaw clenched. His hands, hidden behind the door, curled into fists. But he did not speak. He would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing the wound he had just opened. Koda growled. Low. Steady. A sound that came from somewhere deeper than training, from the place in a dog's chest where loyalty lives alongside instinct. Greer took one step back. I will return, Greer said, with paperwork, and I will not be alone. He walked back to the SUV without hurrying. The door closed with a clean, expensive click. The engine started. Gravel crunched. And then he was gone, swallowed by the pines and the fog and the long winding road back down to whatever world men like him inhabited. Garrett closed the door, locked every bolt, leaned his back against the wood and closed his eyes. Koda pressed against his legs, feeling the tremor in his handler's body. He knew, Garrett whispered. He already knew everything. The answer came 2 hours later, not from Greer, but from a man Garrett had never met. A knock at the back door, softer than Greer's, more hesitant. Koda's reaction was different this time. His tail moved, not a wag exactly. A tentative sway, the kind he gave when he detected grief rather than threat. Garrett opened the door to find a man in his late 60s standing on the back porch. Tall, thin, weathered in the way that Montana men get weathered, as if the wind and the cold have slowly carved away everything that is not essential. He wore a faded canvas jacket and held a leather cap in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. His eyes were the palest blue Garrett had ever seen, and they carried the unfocused distance of a man who has spent years looking at something no one else can see. "You're Hollis," the man said, not a question. "Who are you?" "Harlan Pruitt. I flew with Warren Selby. Panama, 1989. Koda sat down at Garrett's feet, calm now. Whatever this man carried, it was not danger. It was weight. "Greer got here first," Garrett said. Harlan nodded slowly, as if the information was heavy and needed to be set down carefully. "That tracks. He has been circling this house for years, waiting for Warren to die, waiting for someone to find what Warren hid. Come in." They sat in the study. Harlan moved through the room the way Dottie had, touching things, pausing, breathing, in the ghost of a man he had once called a friend. When his hand found the flight jacket on the chair, his fingers lingered on the collar. His jaw worked silently. Then he sat down across from Garrett and told him the truth. Greer was one of us, the fourth pilot. He was the one who made the call to keep silent. And when Warren refused, when Warren tried to report what we had carried out of that jungle, Greer was the one who made sure he was silenced. Not with violence, with paperwork, with whisper campaigns, with the slow, precise destruction of a man's credibility until no one would believe a word he said. Harlan's voice was steady, but his hands were not. They trembled against the leather cap in his lap. Greer traded his silence for a career, climbed the ranks, became the man who investigates military crimes, which is a very convenient position for a man who committed one. He has been waiting for Warren to die so he could reclaim the evidence and bury it permanently. Garrett leaned forward. "The USB drive. 2 of them," Harlan said. "Warren split the evidence, one half in the vault, the other half with me. Together, they contain everything. Names, bank accounts, unauthorized orders, mission logs. Enough to end careers and open investigations that reach all the way to Washington." Harlan reached into his jacket and placed something on the desk. A second USB drive, smaller, older, held together with a strip of electrical tape. "I have been carrying this for 34 years, Harlan said quietly. "Too afraid to use it. Too loyal to destroy it." He looked at Garrett with eyes that carried more exhaustion than a man should be able to hold. "Warren chose you because you were decent to him when no one else was. But I am giving you this because I am tired of being afraid." Garrett looked at the 2 drives, each one smaller than his thumb. Together, they weighed less than an ounce, but the truth they carried was heavy enough to crush everything Greer had built. "He will come back," Garrett said. "Yes, not just with paperwork." Harlan nodded. "Greer does not fight with fists. He fights with systems, injunctions, seizure orders, legal motions that strangle you so slowly you do not realize you are dying until it is too late. He will try to take this house. He will try to freeze your accounts. He will try to make everyone around you afraid to stand next to you. Garrett looked at Koda. The dog was watching Harlan with soft eyes, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to a story told in a language only dogs understand. Then I need to move faster than he does, Garrett said. The next morning, Garrett began, not with lawyers or evidence or strategy, with a hammer. He found tools in the barn behind the mansion, rusted but usable, and started pulling rotted boards from the porch. The sound carried through the still morning air of Thunder Creek like a slow heartbeat returning to a body that had been cold for too long. Each nail he pulled screamed as it came free, and each one left behind a hole in the wood that looked like a small wound closing. It was not much. It was not enough. But it was movement, and movement was the only thing Garrett knew how to do when everything else had stopped making sense. Koda supervised from the top of the steps, lying with his head on his paws, watching Garrett work with the patient attention of a foreman who trusts his crew but intends to keep an eye on them anyway. Every few minutes, Koda would lift his nose to check the wind for anything that did not belong. Each time he settled back down. All clear. Keep working. The first person who came was not someone Garrett called. It was a man who heard the hammering from the road and turned his truck up the driveway out of sheer curiosity. Virgil Teague, 55 years old. Red beard thick enough to lose things in. Hands like shovels scarred across the knuckles from decades of woodwork, the kind of hands that told the story of a man's life more honestly than any words could. A carpenter by trade and a talker by nature, the kind of man who could not pass a broken thing without wanting to fix it. He stepped out of his truck, looked at the mansion, looked at Garrett, looked at the dog and said, "That porch is going to kill you before you fix it." Probably, Garrett said, "You need help." "I didn't ask for any. Nobody ever does. That's why I stopped waiting to be asked." Virgil had his own tools in the truck. Better ones. He unloaded them without permission and was pulling nails from the porch railing before Garrett could decide whether to argue. Within an hour, they had a rhythm. Garrett measured. Virgil cut. Koda lay between them, occasionally moving when a board came too close, always settling back into the exact center of the workspace, as if the quality of the carpentry depended on his supervision. By noon, Virgil had nailed a small wooden sign to the porch post, hand-carved paint still wet. It read, "Dog is foreman. Veteran is intern." Koda looked at the sign. Then he looked at Virgil. Then he tilted his head to one side in a gesture so perfectly timed it could have been rehearsed. "See," Virgil grinned. "He agrees." From that point forward, Virgil called Garrett Sarge. Garrett told him he had never been a sergeant. Virgil said it did not matter. "You've got the face for it," he said. Tired and in charge. Harlan Pruitt came back the following day. He did not bring tools. He brought his presence, which was quieter than tools, and in its own way, more useful. He walked through the mansion making notes on a yellow legal pad cataloging what needed repair, what needed replacing, what could be saved. He spoke little. He worked steadily. And he moved through Warren Selby's house with the careful reverence of a man walking through a church he had been away from for too long. It was on the second afternoon, while Virgil was cutting boards on the back porch, and Garrett was reinforcing a window frame in the study that Harlan spoke. No one had asked him anything. No one had pushed. He simply stopped writing on his legal pad, set down his pencil, and said it. "My son wanted to be a pilot, like his old man." He used to stand at the end of the runway at the county airfield with his arms out, making engine sounds with his mouth. He called the planes dragons. Garrett stopped working. Virgil's saw went quiet. He was 9 years old, Harlan said. Summer of 2011. A thunderstorm came through. Lightning hit the oak tree in our yard. The branch came down on the porch where he was sitting. He did not say another word about it. He picked up his pencil and went back to writing. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything Harlan had not said. The weight of a father's grief compressed into 3 sentences and then sealed shut again, like a door closed carefully so it does not slam. Garrett looked at Koda. The dog had moved without anyone noticing. He was lying at Harlan's feet, his side pressed against the old man's leg, eyes half closed. He had done it the way he always did. Found the pain. Sat with it. Asked nothing in return. Dr. Nessa Fairley arrived the next day. 62 years old, silver hair, cut short eyes sharp enough to read a thermometer from across a room. She was the veterinarian in Thunder Creek, the only one within 40 miles, and she had heard from Virgil that a retired military dog was living up at the Selby estate. She came to check on Koda. She stayed because something about the project pulled at her the way gravity pulls at water. She examined Koda on the porch, running her hands along his ribs, checking his joints, finding the old scar on his left shoulder where shrapnel had caught him in Iraq. She touched the scar gently. "He has been through it," she said quietly, her thumb still tracing the edge of the scar. "We both have," Garrett replied. She looked up at him with an expression that was not pity. It was recognition. The look of a woman who had spent 40 years caring for animals and had learned that the ones who hurt the most are usually the quietest about it. "I will come back tomorrow," she said. "Someone needs to keep an eye on this dog while you people tear this house apart and put it back together." She did come back. And the day after that. And the day after that. She did not talk much. She did not need to. She was competent and calm, and when she said something, it was worth hearing, and when she did not say something, the silence was comfortable rather than heavy. 4 days into the work, Virgil started his circular saw without warning. The blade screamed to life, a high-pitched shriek of metal against wood that split the quiet morning in half like a gunshot splits a church service. The sound bounced off the stone walls of the mansion, amplified by the empty rooms inside, and by the time it reached Garrett's ears, it had become something else entirely. The saw became the whine of an incoming RPG. The sawdust hanging in the air became sand-fine and golden and choking. The porch disappeared, and in its place was a narrow street lined with blown-out buildings in a city whose name he had tried to forget for 4 years. And somewhere behind him, a voice was screaming a name that might have been his. The smell of fresh-cut pine became the smell of burning rubber and hot metal, and something worse, something he would never describe to anyone because the words for it did not exist in any language meant for peacetime. His hands locked against the window frame knuckles, white fingers digging into the wood hard enough to leave marks that would still be there weeks later. His breath stopped. His chest locked. His vision collapsed to a narrow tunnel ringed with black, and at the center of that tunnel was not the porch or Montana or anything that belonged to the present. At the center was a road, a broken road, and on it, a shape he could not look at and could not look away from. Koda was there before the second heartbeat, not beside him this time. The dog pushed directly into Garrett's chest, wedging his whole body between the man and the window frame, forcing Garrett's locked hands to release the wood and grab fur instead. Koda did not place his head on Garrett's thigh the way he usually did. He lay across Garrett's lap, all of him pinning Garrett to the present with the simple, undeniable fact of his weight. Warm, heavy, breathing in a rhythm that said, "Follow me, follow me, follow me, back." Garrett's hand found the dog's fur. He gripped it. His mouth moved. "I'm here, I'm here, I'm here." The street dissolved. The screaming faded. The sawdust settled back into sawdust. The porch reassembled around him piece by piece, plank by plank, until Montana returned and Iraq retreated to the place where it always waited, patient ready to surge back at the next loud sound or the next sharp smell or the next moment when Garrett's guard dropped low enough to let the memories through. Virgil stood 3 steps away. The saw was off. His hand rested on the power switch as if it had been there for a while. His eyes were wet. His mouth was set in a straight line. He did not say, "Are you okay?" He did not say, "I am sorry." He simply waited until Garrett looked up, and then he nodded once, slowly, in a way that said, "I see you. I am not going anywhere." Later that afternoon, Koda cut his shoulder. It happened quickly, the way most injuries do. He was exploring the old fence line behind the barn, pushing through a gap in the rotted planks, and a jagged edge of wood caught his skin and opened a gash about 2 inches long. Not deep, not dangerous, just enough to part the fur and let a thin line of blood darken the gray hair beneath it. But Garrett saw the blood, and the world tilted. He dropped the board he was carrying and crossed the yard in 4 strides. He scooped Koda up, all of him, every pound of muscle and fur and trust, cradling the dog against his chest like he weighed nothing. Koda did not struggle. He pressed his nose into Garrett's neck, confused but trusting. Garrett's face had gone the color of old paper. His eyes were wide and fixed on the wound as if it were something far worse than a cut from a fence. We need to go right now." Virgil stepped forward. "Garrett, it's a scratch. I said we need to go." He drove down the mountain with Koda in the passenger seat, wrapped in his jacket, one hand on the wheel, and the other resting on the dog's chest, counting heartbeats. The drive to Dr. Fairley's clinic took 11 minutes. It felt like an hour. Dr. Fairley met them at the door. She took one look at Koda, one look at Garrett, and understood immediately that the emergency was not the dog. She cleaned the wound. 3 stitches. A bandage wrapped neatly around the shoulder. Koda sat through it all with the dignity of a patient who had endured far worse and knew this was nothing. He licked Dr. Fairley's hand when she finished, and she smiled at him in a way that suggested he was her favorite patient and always would be. Then she turned to Garrett. He was sitting against the wall with his arms wrapped around himself and his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his temples were jumping. His breathing was shallow. His eyes were still locked on Koda, as if looking away might cause the dog to disappear. Dr. Fairley sat down across from him. She did not touch him. She did not crowd him. She simply sat at his level and spoke in a voice that was quiet and direct and carried no judgment whatsoever. He is going to be fine. 3 stitches and 2 days of rest. He is strong and he is healthy, and he will be running circles around you by Thursday. Garrett nodded but did not relax. Dr. Fairley waited a moment. Then she said something that went through Garrett like a blade made of truth. "What are you really trying to fix up there, Garrett, the house or yourself?" He did not answer. Koda limped over and pushed his nose into Garrett's palm. Garrett closed his fingers around the dog's muzzle and held on. After a long time, he exhaled. It was not an answer, but it was not silence either. It was the sound of a man who had just heard a question he was not ready to face, but could no longer pretend he had not heard. 3 days later, the first letter from Greer arrived. Not a visit, not a phone call. A legal document delivered by courier stamped with the seal of the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. It declared the Selby estate a site of interest in an ongoing federal investigation and stated that all materials found on the premises were to remain untouched pending review. The second letter came 2 days after that. This one was from a federal court. An emergency motion to freeze Garrett's bank accounts on the grounds that he was in possession of assets tied to a classified operation. The motion had been filed by Greer's office. Overnight, Garrett could not buy lumber, could not pay for fuel, could not cover the veterinary bill for Koda's stitches. The third letter arrived the following morning, addressed not to Garrett, but to the Thunder Creek County Building Office. It requested an immediate halt to all construction activity at the Selby estate, citing the property as a federal investigation site. Anyone assisting with renovations could be considered party to obstruction of a federal inquiry. Virgil read the letter standing on the porch. His beard bristled. His jaw worked. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into his pocket, and walked to his truck. He came back 10 minutes later, carrying a new sign, freshly carved paint, still wet. Federally investigated carpenter, rates just went up. He nailed it to the porch post next to the first one and went back to work without saying another word. But not everyone stayed. 2 neighbors who had begun helping with the roof stopped coming. A man from the hardware store in town who had been donating scrap lumber called to say he could not continue. The fear was quiet and specific, the kind of fear that comes not from violence, but from paperwork, from the knowledge that a man with government authority can make your life very difficult without ever raising his voice. Greer was not trying to destroy Garrett with force. He was trying to isolate him, to peel away the community that had begun to form around the project person by person until Garrett stood alone again, the way he had been standing when Selby found him. Alone and breakable. Then came the cruelest move. A large envelope arrived at Dottie's home. Inside was a redacted copy of Warren Selby's military file pages, blacked out so heavily they looked like they had been dipped in ink. Attached was a typed letter, unsigned but clearly from Greer's office, suggesting that Captain Selby had not hidden the money out of conscience, but out of greed. That he had been a thief, not a whistleblower. That the dream of a healing center was a story invented to justify decades of criminal hoarding. Dottie called Garrett that evening. Her voice was thin, pulled tight like a wire about to snap. They are saying Warren was a thief. They are saying he kept the money for himself. Do you believe that? A pause, long enough that Garrett's stomach dropped. I believe the letter he wrote me, Dottie said finally. I believe the handwriting. I believe the way the pen pressed harder when he wrote the word forgive. A thief does not write like that. A thief does not apologize to the woman he stole from. She hung up. Garrett sat in the dark study, holding the phone. Koda lay at his feet, nose resting against the side of Garrett's ankle, watching him the way he always watched, patient and unblinking. The days blurred after that. The work slowed. The money was frozen. The lumber ran out. The helpers thinned. Virgil and Harlan and Dr. Fairley stayed, but the circle had shrunk, and the silence left by the people who had gone was louder than the hammering had been. On the 9th night, Garrett sat alone in Warren Selby's study. The house was silent around him. The volunteers had gone home. Virgil's tools sat stacked neatly on the porch. Harlan's legal pad lay closed on the corner of the desk. Dr. Fairley's medical bag hung on a hook by the door. Evidence of people who cared. Evidence that a community had begun to form around him, fragile and new like ice forming on a pond that had been empty all winter. And that was exactly what terrified him. The journals were spread across the desk. The 2 USB drives sat side by side near the lamp, small as fingernails, heavy as coffins. The letter from Selby lay open beside them, the handwriting blurring in the dim light. Garrett read the same line over and over. I could not build it, but you can. He read it until the words lost their shape and became just marks on paper. Then he closed his eyes and felt the thing he had been pushing down for days finally rise to the surface. Not anger at Greer, not frustration about the frozen accounts or the legal threats or the people who had stopped coming. Something far below all of that. Something that had nothing to do with money or government agents or courtrooms. Fear. Not fear of losing the house. Not fear of going to court. Fear of something far worse. The fear that he would care about this project and these people and this purpose with his whole heart, the way he had cared about his unit in Iraq, and then lose it all. The way he had lost them. The fear that he would pour himself into building something beautiful and then stand in the wreckage when it was taken away emptier than he had been before, with nothing left to fill the hole. The fear that Warren Selby had been right about him, that he was just a lonely man reaching for any reason to keep going, and that when the reason was gone, he would have nothing left to reach for. He picked up the phone and called Harlan. It was nearly midnight. The old man answered on the second ring, as if he had been waiting. I can't do this, Garrett said. His voice was flat, emptied out. Call a lawyer. Sell everything. Give it to the government. Let Greer have it. I'm done. Harlan did not respond immediately. The silence on the line stretched long enough that Garrett checked to see if the call had dropped. It had not. Harlan was simply sitting, with the words giving them the space they needed before he answered. You know, Harlan said finally, and his voice was hoarse, as if the words were being pulled out of a place that had not been opened in a very long time. After my boy died, I went quiet. Not the regular kind of quiet. The kind where you stop hearing your own voice inside your head. The kind where you forget you exist unless someone says your name. Garrett listened. Koda shifted at his feet, pressing closer. I spent 13 years like that. 13 years listening to thunder and wishing it would take me too. 13 years sitting in a house full of my son's drawings and his model planes and the sound of his voice calling the engines dragons playing over and over in my head until I could not tell if I was remembering or going insane. Harlan's breath shook on the line. Walking away is not rest, Garrett. Walking away is exile. And I know what exile looks like because I have been living in it since the summer of 2011. Do not come to where I am. Do not let them put you there. I will not let thunder take one more person. The line went quiet. Garrett sat in the dark. The phone was warm against his ear. Koda's breathing was slow and steady against his ankle. Outside, the wind had died. The house was still. Even the trees seemed to be listening. I hear you, Garrett whispered. Then stay. Garrett hung up. He sat for a long time in the chair, feeling the silence settle over him like snow. Then he stood, slowly. His bad knee protested, and he gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself. He reached for his backpack. He pulled his jacket from the hook behind the door. He packed the few things he had brought: the flashlight, the thermos, the letter. He zipped the bag. He slung it over his shoulder, and he walked toward the front door. Koda was already there. The dog stood in front of the door, centered squared, as if he had been placed there by something older than instinct. He was not barking. He was not growling. He was not pacing or whining or scratching at the wood. He was simply standing, shoulders level, ears upright, brown eyes fixed on Garrett with an expression that held no anger and no fear and no judgment. Only presence. Only the absolute immovable certainty of a creature who had decided that this door would not open. "Move," Garrett said. Koda did not move. Garrett stepped to the left. Koda shifted with him, smooth and silent, blocking the path as if they were dancing a step he already knew. Garrett stepped to the right. Koda was there first. "Move, Koda. I mean it." The dog exhaled through his nose. A long, slow breath, the kind that in dog language means "I heard you, and I am choosing not to listen." Garrett stared at him. The backpack hung heavy on his shoulder. The door was right there. The truck was outside. The road down the mountain was dark, but he knew every curve. He could be back at his cabin in 20 minutes. He could close the door. He could sit in the silence. He could go back to being no one in a place where no one looked for him. All he had to do was get past his dog. He tried once more. A half step forward, testing. Koda leaned into the space, not aggressively, but absolutely the way a wall leans against the earth. There was no getting around him. There was no getting through him. There was only Koda, 85 pounds of loyalty, standing between a broken man and the worst decision of his life. Garrett's throat closed, his vision blurred. His hand released the strap of the backpack, and the bag slid off his shoulder and hit the floor with a soft, heavy sound that echoed through the empty foyer. He dropped to his knees. The floor was hard and cold and dusty beneath him. He felt it through the fabric of his jeans, the same knees that had knelt on sand and concrete and hospital tiles and church floors, in moments when standing was no longer something his body could do. But this time was different. This time he was not falling. He was choosing to stop. Both hands found Koda's fur, gripping the thick ruff around his neck, fingers burying themselves deep into the warmth beneath. He pulled the dog toward him and pressed his forehead against Koda's shoulder. The dog was solid and real and smelled of sawdust and pine needles, and the faint copper trace of the stitches in his shoulder that were still healing, because he had gotten hurt exploring a fence that belonged to a house that belonged to a dead man who had trusted a stranger. Koda's heart beat against Garrett's chest, strong, even, unafraid. "I'm tired," Garrett whispered. His voice cracked on the second word and broke open entirely on the third. "I'm so tired." Koda leaned into him, not pulling away, not pushing forward, just leaning, letting his weight settle against Garrett's chest, warm and steady and real. The dog's breath was slow against Garrett's neck. In, out, in, out. The same rhythm he used during the PTSD episodes. The same rhythm that meant "I am here and I am not leaving and you are not alone. And whatever you are feeling right now is allowed and it will pass and I will still be here when it does." Koda licked Garrett's hand, once, twice. Garrett did not stand up for a long time. He knelt on the dusty floor of Warren Selby's mansion with his arms around his dog and his face pressed into the fur of the only living thing that had never given up on him. And somewhere in that silence, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the decision was made. Not with words, not with logic, not with courage. With something simpler and more stubborn than any of those things. He was staying because his dog would not let him leave, and because his dog was right. When he finally stood, the backpack stayed on the floor. He did not pick it up. He walked back to the study, sat down in the leather chair, and placed both hands flat on the desk. Koda followed, circled twice, and lay down at his feet, with a sigh that sounded, if you listened closely enough, like relief. The next morning, Garrett sent a message to Harlan Virgil and Dr. Fairley. 2 words. Keep going. Virgil arrived first. He read the message on his phone, looked at Garrett, looked at the backpack still lying by the front door, and understood. He said nothing about it. He simply picked up his hammer and started on the east wall. Dr. Fairley came next. She checked Koda's stitches, pronounced them healing well, and stayed to help organize supplies. She moved through the house with the calm efficiency of a woman who had spent her life fixing what was broken and did not need to be told what to do. Harlan came last. He walked in slowly, carrying nothing but his legal pad and a thermos of coffee. He met Garrett's eyes across the room and held the look for 3 seconds. That was enough. Both men understood what had happened in the night. Both men understood why Garrett was still here. Neither needed to speak about it. The days that followed carried a different energy. Something had changed, not in the house, but in the air around it, as if the mountain itself had felt the shift and decided to lean in rather than push away. People began arriving that no one had called. A woman from the next valley brought sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and a note that said simply, "Keep going." An old rancher drove up with a truck bed full of pine planks he said he had no use for and would not accept payment for, even if Garrett's accounts had not been frozen. A retired electrician showed up with wire cutters and a headlamp and started tracing the dead wiring through the walls without being asked, humming to himself as he worked, filling the house with a sound that was not quite music, but was close enough to feel like it. Thunder Creek was waking up. Slowly, reluctantly, the way a person wakes from a long sleep in a cold room, pulling closer to the warmth without yet opening their eyes. The sound of hammers and saws carried down the mountain and into the town, and something in that sound called to people the way church bells call to the faithful, not with command, but with invitation. And then Dottie came. Garrett saw her from the porch. She walked up the driveway alone, wearing the same gray wool coat, carrying nothing this time. No scarf, no letter, just herself. She walked slowly the way a person walks into a room where they once lived and lost everything. She did not speak to Garrett first. She walked through the front door, through the foyer, through the hall, and into Warren's study. She stood in the center of the room and turned a full circle, taking in the shelves that had been dusted, the windows that had been cleaned, the desk that had been polished. The flight jacket still hung on the chair. Someone had brushed it. Dottie placed her hand on the wall. The plaster was cool beneath her palm. She closed her eyes. "He would love this," she said quietly. He would love that someone finally heard him. Then she sat down. In Warren's chair. At Warren's desk. In the room where he had written his journals and his dreams and his confession. She sat down the way a person sits when they have decided to stop running from the place that hurts them most. Koda was already there. He had been lying beside the chair before Dottie sat down as if he had known she was coming before she did. His head rested near her shoe. His eyes looked up at her soft and patient, holding a space for her grief, the way a cupped hand holds water carefully so none of it spills. Dottie's hand found his head. She held it there. She did not cry this time. She smiled. Small and fragile and real, the first smile in 20 years that was not covering something else. Garrett watched from the doorway. He did not enter the room. This moment did not belong to him. It belonged to Dottie and to Warren's ghost and to a dog who understood grief better than most humans ever would. But standing there watching a woman smile for the first time in 20 years, while a dog breathed slowly at her feet, Garrett felt something shift in his own chest, a loosening. Like a fist that had been clenched for so long, the fingers had forgotten they could open. He was not healed. He knew that. He might never be fully healed. But something was different. The house was different. The silence was different. It was no longer the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of a place that was being rebuilt, and the space between the hammer strikes was filled not with emptiness, but with waiting. Waiting for the next nail, the next board, the next person who would walk up the driveway and decide to stay. That evening, Harlan placed the second USB drive on the desk next to the first. Two halves of a truth that had been buried for 34 years. Together, he said, these contain everything: names, accounts, orders, enough to end Greer and everyone who stood behind him. Garrett looked at the drives. He looked at Harlan. He looked at Dottie, who was still sitting in Warren's chair, her hand resting on the desk as if drawing strength from the wood itself. "Greer's filing for an emergency hearing," Garrett said. 3 days. Harlan nodded. "Then we have 3 days." Outside the window, the last light of the day turned the pines to gold. Koda lifted his head from Dottie's feet and looked toward the door ears forward, tail still. The air carried the faint smell of sawdust and fresh lumber and the clean, cold scent of a Montana evening. Something was coming. Koda could feel it. The final test. The last wall between Garrett Hollis and the life Warren Selby had dreamed for him. Garrett looked at the drives. He looked at the letter. He looked at the faces around him. Harlan with his trembling hands and his yellow legal pad full of notes, Dottie in Warren's chair with her palm still resting on the desk, and somewhere on the porch, Virgil's laugh carrying through the evening air as he showed the electrician his latest sign. These people had stayed. Through the legal threats and the frozen accounts and the fear that Greer had tried to pour into every corner of Thunder Creek, these people had stayed. Not because Garrett had asked them to, not because they owed him anything, because something in the sound of a hammer hitting wood on a quiet mountain morning had reminded them of a thing they had almost forgotten: that broken things can be rebuilt, that empty houses can be filled, that a man and his dog working alone on a porch in the fog can become the beginning of something no one expected. 3 days. That was all the time they had before Greer would stand in a courtroom and try to bury the truth one final time. Koda laid his head on his paws and closed his eyes. He was not worried. He had stopped a man from walking out a door. A courtroom was nothing compared to that. The 3 days before the hearing passed like weather, fast in some places, slow in others, and impossible to control. The first day was preparation. Harlan spread the contents of both USB drives across the study desk, printing files on a portable printer Dr. Fairley brought from her clinic. Names, bank routing numbers, mission orders, with signatures that should never have existed on paper, transfer authorizations dated from 1989 to 1996 that traced a river of stolen money from a jungle airstrip in Panama to accounts scattered across 3 continents. The evidence was massive and meticulous. Warren Selby had spent 34 years collecting it the way a man builds a wall 1 stone at a time, knowing that one day the flood would come and the wall would need to hold. Garrett sat beside Harlan, reading each document, asking questions, learning the shape of a conspiracy he had inherited along with the house that hid it. Koda lay beneath the desk, his back warm against Garrett's shins, breathing slowly, steady as a clock. Dr. Fairley organized the medical records and personal journals into chronological order, marking pages with colored tabs she had taken from her veterinary supply closet. She worked with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent decades organizing complex information under pressure. When Garrett asked her why she was doing all of this, she looked at him over the top of her reading glasses and said, "Because someone needs to, and I am very good at it." Virgil's contribution was different. He could not read legal documents or sort evidence. He did not understand bank routing numbers or military chain of command or the difference between DCIS and NCIS, but he could build. And in those 3 days, while the others prepared for a battle fought with paper and words, Virgil fought with wood and nails. He finished the porch. Every board replaced, sanded, and sealed. Every railing straight and true. Every nail driven flush with the surface so no splinter would catch the hand of anyone who reached for the railing. He worked from sunrise to dark, stopping only to eat the sandwiches that appeared on the porch rail at noon, left by someone from town who never identified themselves. On the second evening, he hung a new sign near the front door. This one was not funny. It read in careful carved letters, "Selby House, built on truth." The letters were deep and precise, cut with the care a man gives to words he believes in. Koda inspected the sign by sniffing it thoroughly, then sat in front of it as if posing for a photograph no one was taking. But it was Dottie who made the decision that changed everything. On the second day, she arrived at the mansion early before anyone else, carrying a cardboard box. Inside were documents she had kept for 20 years. Warren's personal letters, their marriage certificate, photographs from his service years, and a handwritten will dated 3 months before his death, notarized by a lawyer in Helena, naming Garrett Hollis as sole heir, and explicitly stating that all assets found on the property were bequeathed with the intention of establishing a veterans healing center. "He sent me this," Dottie said, placing the will on the desk. "6 months ago. I did not open it until last week. I was afraid of what it would say." But that was not the decision that changed everything. The decision came later that afternoon, when Dottie sat at the kitchen table with Garrett's phone and called the FBI field office in Billings. Then she called the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Then she called a reporter at the Helena Independent Record whom she had known for 30 years. "I am Dorothea Selby." She told each of them her voice, steady her hands, not steady at all. "My husband was Captain Warren Selby, United States Air Force. He died 8 months ago. He left behind evidence of a military corruption operation dating to 1989. An agent named Malcolm Greer is attempting to suppress this evidence through the federal courts. I am calling to ensure that does not happen." When she finished the calls, she set the phone down and looked at Garrett. "I was silent for 34 years because Warren asked me to be. He is gone now, and I am done being quiet." The second night brought the storm. It came from the northwest, rolling over the mountains like a black wave, swallowing the stars one by one, until the sky was nothing but darkness and the sound of wind tearing through pines. Thunder broke overhead with a crack so sharp it seemed to split the air itself. Rain followed hard and relentless, hammering the new roof and streaming down the windows in sheets that made the world outside disappear. Garrett was in the upstairs bedroom when the first bolt of lightning hit somewhere on the ridge. The flash turned the room white. The thunder arrived a half-second later, deep enough to vibrate the floorboards beneath his feet. And inside his head, the sound became something else. Not a saw this time, not wind. Thunder, real thunder. But his body did not care about the difference. His body only knew the pattern. Loud noise, flash of light, concussion wave. And then the memories came fast and hard, like water breaking through a dam. He was on the floor before he knew he had fallen, his back pressed against the wall. His knees were drawn to his chest. His hands were over his ears, and his eyes were shut tight, and his breathing had become the shallow, rapid panting of a man whose lungs have forgotten how to work. The room was Iraq. The thunder was an IED. The rain on the roof was gunfire. The world was ending again, and he could not stop it from ending. Koda was there. Of course he was there. He was always there. The dog pressed against Garrett's side, fitting himself into the space between the man and the wall, warm and solid and breathing with the deliberate slowness of a creature who has done this before, and will do it again, and will never stop doing it for as long as he lives. His head found Garrett's thigh. His weight settled. His breathing became a rhythm that Garrett's body could follow even when his mind could not. A sound at the door. Not thunder. Footsteps. Harlan appeared in the doorway, hair wet from the rain face drawn. He looked at Garrett on the floor, and Koda pressed against him, and he did not ask what was wrong. He did not offer advice. He did not say it will pass, or you are safe, or any of the things that well-meaning people say to men in the grip of something they have never felt. Harlan sat down on the floor, 3 feet away, back against the opposite wall, and he stayed there silent, present, another body in the room, another heartbeat in the dark. 2 veterans and a dog sitting on the floor of a dead man's house, while a storm raged outside each of them carrying a war they could not put down, none of them alone. The thunder rolled on. Koda breathed. Garrett followed. Slowly, one breath at a time, the room became Montana again. The floor became wood. The rain became rain. And the darkness outside the window was just darkness, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that eventually gives way to morning. Garrett opened his eyes. Harlan was watching him, not with pity, but with the quiet recognition of a man who has sat in his own version of this same room, on his own version of this same floor, many times for 13 years. "Still here," Garrett whispered. "Still here," Harlan said. They did not speak again. After a while, Harlan stood, nodded once, and went back downstairs. Koda stayed. He would stay all night if Garrett needed him to. He always did. It was past midnight when Koda's ears snapped forward. Garrett had been lying on the bed, not sleeping, but resting, listening to the storm weaken. Koda had been curled beside him, one eye open, in the way dogs sleep when they are never fully off duty. But something changed. The dog's head lifted. His nostrils flared. His body shifted from rest to alert in a single silent motion, and he slipped off the bed and padded to the door. Garrett followed. Downstairs, Koda moved through the dark hallway toward the back of the house, toward the room where the evidence was spread across the desk. His pace was measured. His tail was low and stiff. He was not panicking. He was patrolling. Through the window at the end of the hall, Garrett saw it. A shape on the back porch. Human. Standing in the rain. Not breaking in. Not forcing entry. Just standing there looking at the door. Garrett moved closer. The shape became a man. And the man became Malcolm Greer. He was alone. No SUV, no agents, no tactical gear. Just a man in a wet overcoat standing on the back porch of a house he had been trying to reclaim for years, and the expression on his face was not anger or authority. It was something closer to exhaustion. Greer raised his hand and knocked. 2 soft knocks. Almost polite. Garrett did not open the door. He stood in the hallway watching through the glass. Koda stood beside him, but the dog had moved ahead, positioning himself directly in front of the door to the study where the evidence lay on the desk. He did not bark. He did not growl. He did not bare his teeth. He simply stood there planted and silent, a living barrier between a corrupt man and the truth he had spent 34 years trying to bury. Greer spoke through the door. His voice was muffled by rain and glass, but clear enough to hear. There was a weariness in it that had not been there before. The voice of a man who has been running for a very long time and can feel the ground behind him beginning to give way. Hollis, open the door. I am not here to threaten you. I am here to talk. One soldier to another. Garrett said nothing. He watched Koda. The dog had not blinked. You and I are the same, Greer continued. We were both used by a system that chewed us up and spit us out. Selby was no different. He kept that money because he could. He dressed it up in noble language, but at the end of the day, he was just another man holding on to something that did not belong to him. The rain intensified. It hammered the porch roof in heavy sheets. Water streamed down the glass between Greer's face and the dark hallway where a dog stood motionless, guarding a truth that was no longer willing to stay buried. Garrett looked at Koda. The dog had not moved a single muscle. His eyes were locked on the door on the shadow behind the glass with an intensity that was neither aggressive nor afraid. It was certain. The door would not open. The evidence would not move. Koda had decided, and Koda's decisions were final in the same way gravity is final. Not because they were enforced, but because they were true. Greer waited. Rain soaked through his coat and ran in streams from the brim of his hat. He stood there for a full minute, staring at the door, staring at the shadow of a dog behind the glass who would not move and would not bark and would not let him pass. Then his shoulders dropped, just slightly. Just enough to show that something in him had recognized something in the dog that he could not overcome with paperwork or persuasion or the weight of a government badge. He turned and walked off the porch and into the rain and into the dark. The sound of his footsteps faded. The forest swallowed him. And Koda stood at the door for another 10 minutes, watching, waiting, making absolutely sure, before he finally turned and walked back to Garrett and pressed his nose into Garrett's palm. Good boy, Garrett whispered. Real good boy. The morning of the hearing broke clean and bright as if the storm had washed something out of the sky that had been dirty for a very long time. Garrett dressed in the only clothes he owned that were not stained with sawdust or paint. A white shirt, dark pants, his service boots polished for the first time in 4 years. He looked in the mirror and saw a man he almost recognized. Tired, scarred, but standing. Koda waited by the truck, tail low, ears high, ready. The Thunder Creek County Courthouse was a small stone building at the center of town built in 1923 with wooden benches and tall windows that let in light the color of honey. It smelled of old paper and floor wax and the particular quiet that settles over rooms where important things are decided. Greer was already seated when Garrett entered. He wore a fresh suit. His hair was combed. His posture was perfect. Beside him sat a federal attorney in a charcoal jacket carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than Garrett's truck. They did not look at Garrett as he walked in. They did not need to. Their confidence filled the room like a scent. Garrett sat on the other side, Harlan beside him, Dr. Fairley behind them. Virgil in the back row arms crossed, red beard bristling. Dottie sat at the end of Garrett's bench, straight-backed hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed forward. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Ruth Calloway. She had silver hair and reading glasses and a face that suggested she had heard every lie a courtroom could produce and had long since stopped being impressed by any of them. Greer's attorney spoke first. His argument was polished and precise. The Selby estate contained assets tied to a classified military operation. Captain Selby had removed these assets without authorization. The estate was therefore subject to federal seizure. Garrett Hollis had no legal standing to retain the property or its contents. The motion for emergency seizure should be granted immediately. The words filled the courtroom with the clean, cold logic of a system designed to protect itself. When the attorney finished, the silence that followed was heavy. Garrett felt it press against his chest. He looked at the judge. Her expression gave nothing away. Then Harlan stood. He rose slowly, the way old men rise when their knees carry more history than their legs can comfortably support. He gripped the back of the bench in front of him and steadied himself. His hands trembled. His voice did not. My name is Harlan Pruitt. I served in the United States Air Force from 1978 to 1995. In 1989, I was one of 4 pilots assigned to a classified pickup operation in the Republic of Panama. Greer's jaw tightened. His attorney leaned forward. We were told we were transporting intelligence materials. The cases we loaded onto our aircraft contained cash. Millions of dollars in bribe money connected to an operation that was never authorized by any legitimate command structure. When Captain Selby tried to report what we had carried, he was silenced. Not with violence, with paperwork, with the systematic destruction of his credibility by the very people who had ordered the mission. Harlan paused. His gaze found Greer across the courtroom. The man who silenced him is sitting in this room. Agent Malcolm Greer was the 4th pilot. He traded his silence for a career. He has spent 34 years ensuring that the truth about that mission never reached daylight. The courtroom shifted. The judge's pen stopped moving. Greer's attorney whispered something sharp and urgent. Greer's face did not change, but his hands folded on the table in front of him tightened until the knuckles went pale. Dr. Fairley stood next. She presented the journals, organized, tabbed, authenticated by a forensic document examiner she had contacted through the University of Montana. She laid out the timeline with the clarity of a scientist and the precision of a woman who had spent 40 years diagnosing problems that could not speak for themselves. Then Dottie stood. She was the last to speak, and she spoke the fewest words, and they were the words that mattered most. She rose from the bench with the careful dignity of a woman who has spent 20 years sitting with grief, and has finally decided to stand up in front of it. My name is Dorothea Selby. Warren Selby was my husband for 23 years, and the man I loved for all of them, including the 20 we spent apart. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the way a church bell carries across a valley, not because of force, but because of clarity. He did not keep that money out of greed. He kept it because he had a dream he was too afraid to build. A place for soldiers to heal. A place with open doors and quiet rooms, and the kind of peace he spent his whole life looking for and never found. Her voice trembled but did not break. Her hands folded in front of her were perfectly still. He died alone in a hospital bed 8 months ago. His last words to the nurse were, "Tell them I am sorry I ran out of time." He was not talking about himself. He was talking about the men and women he could not save. The ones still carrying their wars home with them. The ones sitting alone in cabins on mountains talking to their dogs because their dogs are the only ones left. She paused. The courtroom held its breath. She looked directly at Greer. Her eyes were dry and clear and held more steel than anything in his briefcase. "My husband lived 34 years in fear because of the men you protect. He died with a dream that was never built. Do not let them kill that dream again." The courtroom was silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of a room that does not know what to say. The full silence of a room that has just heard the truth spoken plainly by someone who has no reason to lie. Garrett stood last. He placed both USB drives on the table. Then he placed Warren Selby's handwritten will beside them, notarized legal witness dated 3 months before his death. He did not make a speech. He said only what was necessary. Everything is here. The evidence, the will, the intent. Captain Selby left this to me with one instruction: build what he could not. I intend to do that. Judge Calloway looked at the drives. She looked at the will. She looked at Greer, whose attorney was now whispering with the urgency of a man trying to stop water from pouring through a crack in a wall. She removed her glasses and set them on the bench. The motion for emergency seizure is denied. The will is valid. The property remains in the stewardship of Mr. Hollis. The evidence presented today will be forwarded to the FBI and NCIS for independent review. And Agent Greer, she said, turning her gaze to him with the quiet precision of a woman who has waited her entire career for a moment like this. I strongly suggest you retain personal counsel. Virgil whistled from the back row. One sharp, triumphant note that bounced off the stone walls and made the bailiff frown. Harlan did not whistle. He did not cheer. He sat down, slowly placed his hands on his knees, and cried, silently. The way men cry when the thing they have been carrying for decades is finally set down. And the relief is so overwhelming, it comes out as water instead of words. Dottie reached across the bench and took Garrett's hand. She held it lightly briefly and then let go. It was enough. It said everything that needed to be said. We did it. He would be proud. Thank you. 2 months later, the Selby estate opened its doors. The sign above the entrance, carved by Virgil, painted by Dottie, and approved by Koda via a thorough sniffing inspection, read Thunder Creek Veterans Healing Center. Below it, in smaller letters, built on a dream. Finished by friends. Half the mansion had been restored into a warm, open space filled with light. Counseling rooms with soft chairs and windows that looked out onto the mountains. A small medical wing for service animals equipped and staffed by Dr. Fairley, who had closed her private practice to run it full-time. A common room with a fireplace, the same stone fireplace where Koda had first pressed his nose against the wall and sensed something hidden beneath, now cleaned and lit and surrounded by chairs where veterans could sit and be quiet together without having to explain why. The other half of the mansion remained a home. Garrett's home. The first real home he had lived in since before the war. The opening day brought more people than Thunder Creek had seen in years. Veterans from across Montana and beyond some driving hours to reach a place they had only heard about through word of mouth, through a phone call from a friend, through the quiet network of men and women who served and who recognized the sound of something real when they hear it. Families came. Children. Volunteers who had been part of the building without knowing the full story. The woman from the next valley who had brought sandwiches during the renovation stood near the door crying into a napkin. The rancher who had donated pine planks leaned against his truck and nodded slowly, as if confirming to himself that the wood had been used well. The electrician who had traced the dead wiring walked through the rooms, touching the light switches he had installed, turning them on and off with the quiet pride of a man who knows his work will outlast him. And among them, moving through the crowd with the silent grace of a creature who understands that his job is never finished, was Koda. Koda moved through the crowd like a host at a party he had personally organized. He accepted belly rubs with dignity. He leaned against the legs of strangers who looked nervous, pressing his weight against them until their shoulders dropped and their breathing slowed. He allowed small children to touch his ears and did not flinch when a toddler grabbed his tail. He was in every way that mattered doing the work he had been born to do, finding the ones who were hurting, sitting with them, asking nothing in return. Virgil had nailed one final sign to the porch post that morning. It read, "Built by a dog, assisted by veterans." Dr. Fairley had sighed. Harlan had smiled. Garrett had said nothing, but the corner of his mouth had lifted in a way that Virgil counted as a victory. It was late in the afternoon when Garrett noticed the girl. She was standing near the edge of the gathering, half hidden behind her father's leg. 7 years old, maybe 8, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and eyes that were too wide and too watchful for a child her age. Her father was a veteran. Garrett could tell by the way he stood, the way his eyes swept the crowd in regular intervals, the way his hand rested on his daughter's shoulder, not with affection but with vigilance, the unconscious posture of a man who has not yet convinced his body that the war is over. A car backfired on the road below the mansion. The sound was sharp and sudden, cracking through the afternoon air like a branch breaking. The father flinched. The daughter did more than flinch. She dropped into a crouch, hands over her ears, eyes squeezed shut, her small body curling inward, as if trying to become something too small to be found. She had learned this from watching her father. She had absorbed his fear the way children absorb everything completely and without understanding. Garrett saw it happen, and something inside him moved. Not the old thing, not the panic or the guilt or the frozen paralysis of a man trapped in his own memory. Something new, something that felt like the opposite of breaking. He walked to the girl. He did not rush. He did not crouch over her or touch her or make any sudden movement. He simply lowered himself to one knee, slowly, his bad knee protesting, as it always did, and placed himself at her level, close enough to be heard, far enough to not feel like a wall. "Hey," he said softly, "my name is Garrett. Can you hear me?" The girl's eyes opened. They were wet and wide and filled with the specific terror of a child who does not understand why the world makes sounds that hurt. "I want you to try something with me. Can you do that?" She nodded, just barely. "Breathe in through your nose. Count to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. She breathed in, shaky and thin, but in. Now hold it. 1, 2, 3, 4. She held it, her small chest puffed out. Now breathe out through your mouth, slow. 1, 2, 3, 4. She breathed out. A long, trembling exhale that took some of the fear with it. Koda appeared beside them. He had crossed the yard without being called, moving through the crowd with the silent precision of a dog who has found the person who needs him most. He lay down next to the girl, close enough for her to touch, but not so close as to crowd her, and placed his chin on the grass near her knee. His brown eyes looked up at her with an expression that held nothing but patience and warmth. "This is Koda," Garrett said. "He is my friend. He wants you to know that you are safe here." The girl looked at the dog. The dog looked at the girl. And something passed between them that did not require language or explanation. The same thing that had passed between Koda and Garrett on 100 dark nights. The same thing that had passed between Koda and Dottie on a dusty porch. The same thing that had passed between Koda and Harlan in a room full of grief. "I see you. You are not alone." The girl reached out and placed her hand on Koda's head. Her fingers curled into his fur. Her breathing steadied. Her shoulders dropped. And after a long moment, she leaned forward and put her arms around the dog's neck and held on the way only a child can hold on with everything she had, without reservation, without self-consciousness, without any of the armor that adults build between themselves and the things that save them. Koda did not move. He let her hold him for as long as she needed. His eyes closed halfway the way they did when he was content, when he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was made to do. His tail moved once against the grass. A slow, gentle sweep. The smallest possible gesture with the largest possible meaning. "I am here. You are safe. This is what I was born for." Her father stood behind them. His eyes were red. His jaw worked silently. He looked at Garrett and nodded once. One veteran recognizing another. One broken man thanking another broken man for showing his daughter that the world contained not only sounds that hurt, but also hands that healed and dogs that knew how to sit with the scared and the small and the lost until they remembered they were none of those things. Dottie watched from the porch. She had been watching for a while. Her gray wool coat was buttoned against the afternoon chill, and her hands were wrapped around a cup of coffee. She was not crying. She was smiling. A full smile, warm and real, the kind that reaches the eyes and changes the shape of a face. The kind that takes 20 years of grief to earn. The crowd thinned as evening approached. The last volunteers packed up. The last veterans shook Garrett's hand and climbed into their trucks. The mansion settled into the golden quiet of a Montana sunset light that turns everything it touches into something worth remembering. Garrett stood at the mantelpiece in the study. He had cleaned it himself, polished the stone, swept the ash from the firebox. On the mantel, he placed a framed photograph of Captain Warren Selby in his flight jacket, young and sharp-eyed, and full of a purpose that takes a lifetime to understand. Beside it, he placed the letter. The original in Selby's handwriting pressed flat under glass. Below the frame on a small brass plate that Virgil had engraved that morning were words Garrett had chosen carefully because he was not a man who used many and did not want to waste the ones he had. "You trusted me when I could not trust myself. Your burden is no longer yours alone. I will not let you down." He stood there for a long time, looking at the photograph, looking at the letter, feeling the house breathe around him. It was not empty anymore. It was not haunted. It was not a tomb or a vault or a secret. It was a place where broken things came to be rebuilt, and the sound that filled it now was not silence, but the quiet hum of a life beginning again. Koda appeared beside him. The dog sat and leaned against Garrett's leg the way he always did, the way he had done in Iraq and Montana, and in every dark room and bright morning between. Garrett placed his hand on the dog's head. "We did it," he whispered. Koda's tail moved once, slow, certain. "Yes, we did." They walked outside together as the sun dropped behind the ridge. The sky was painted in bands of gold and copper and the deep blue that comes just before the stars appear. The air smelled of pine and fresh lumber and the clean scent of rain that has finished falling. The porch boards were solid beneath their feet. New wood. Strong wood. Wood that would hold the weight of everyone who came here looking for a place to rest. Dottie stood on the porch, leaning against the railing, watching them go. The unfinished scarf was not in her hands tonight. She had placed it in a glass case in the entryway of the healing center next to a small card that read, "In memory of Warren Selby, who ran out of time, but never ran out of love." Visitors would see it when they walked in. They would not know the full story, but they would understand the shape of it. An unfinished thing. A love that continued past the last stitch. A dream handed forward. "Dogs know the way home," she said. Garrett stopped. He turned and looked at her, then at the mansion behind her, its windows glowing with the warm light of the lamps that Virgil had wired and Dr. Fairley had tested. And Harlan had turned on for the first time, standing in the foyer with his hand on the switch, tears on his cheeks, whispering something that no one else heard. Home. The word had meant nothing to Garrett for 4 years. It had been a sound without a shape, a door without a room behind it. But standing here on this mountain, in this light, with this dog pressing against his leg, and this woman on the porch, and these people scattered across the valley who had chosen to stay when staying was hard, the word finally meant something again. Home was not a place where the pain stopped. Home was a place where the pain did not have to be carried alone. He walked on. Koda walked beside him. The trail wound through the pines, dappled with the last light of the day quiet, except for the sound of their footsteps and the distant call of an evening bird. Then Koda stopped. Not a freeze. Not the rigid, alert stillness of a dog sensing danger. Something different. Koda stood in the middle of the trail with his nose lifted into the wind nostrils flaring, gently pulling at a scent carried from somewhere down in the valley. His ears were up. His tail moved in a slow, easy wag. His eyes were bright. He turned and looked at Garrett with an expression that held no urgency and no warning. Just interest. Just the calm, curious attention of a dog who has found something worth investigating. Garrett followed Koda's gaze. Down below, through the thinning trees, a small light flickered. Faint. Warm. The light of a window in a house he had never noticed before, tucked into a fold of the valley where the forest met the meadow. He looked at Koda. Koda looked back at him. That same brown-eyed steadiness. That same quiet certainty that had guided Garrett through every dark room and every darker night since the day they were paired together in a kennel outside Fort Benning. Two damaged creatures who did not know yet that they would become each other's reason to keep going. Garrett smiled. It came slowly, the way dawn comes to a valley, filling in from the edges, and by the time it reached his eyes, it was the most natural thing in the world. Again, he said. Koda barked once, soft, happy. The bark of a dog who has found something worth following and trusts his human to come along. They walked on. The light in the valley grew brighter. The trail curved downward. And behind them, on the ridge, the Selby estate stood tall against the fading sky, its windows glowing, its doors open, its porch solid and new, a house that had been dead for 34 years alive again, because a man knelt beside a stranger in the snow and a dog stood in front of a door and refused to move. If you stayed until this moment, thank you. You are the reason stories like this get told. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Not a number, not a code, just a question. Who is the loyal friend that kept you going? The one who stayed when it would have been easier to leave. The one who sat with you in the dark until the dark became a little less dark. Tell me about them in the comments. I will read every single one. And if this story made you feel something, if Koda made you smile, if Garrett made you believe that broken things can find their way home, then subscribe. Because the next story is already waiting. And I think you are going to want to hear it.